Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Condo Solutions. Monday mornings, 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about the things that affect you in your condo, your homeowners association, your co-op, whatever the case may be. My name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a local CPA and a CAM, a licensed community association manager. And joining me every week for the last umpteen years, 16 of them or so, Peter Mullengarden, who's our attorney and has been practicing in this area longer than Moses. So we're here to help you with your concerns and questions. Many of you are new to the regulations that exist in the condo and HOA market. Maybe you moved down from up north and haven't had the opportunity to experience some of the things that we have here, which, by the way, all in all is a good thing. It protects you in a community living association. It's one of those kind of things where it gives you the ability to function and handle your property in a shared environment, which is important. Anytime that you have multiple owners, it makes it challenging if you don't have some sort of guidance. As we know in the HOA area, where there's not a lot of recourse beyond the courts, it's very difficult sometimes to accomplish something in that area. So we are a call-in show. 220-9788, 220-WSTU is the number in the studio. If you want to call, we'd be happy to take the call. You don't have to give us the association name. We, as we always say, we prefer probably that you don't, for a couple reasons. One, other people might hear some other association and think, well, it doesn't apply to me, and it could be that it applies exactly to them. And so that's the main reason. The second reason is you might be one of our associations and we don't want to know. So because we don't want to tell you that. But anyway, so you don't need to give us the association name, and you don't have to give us your actual name. I know some people are concerned sometimes that somebody might be able to figure it out. And so just, give us a name that we can call you. If you want to use your real name, we don't care about that either. That's fine. The one thing we always caution is that we'll give you the best possible answer we can, but we don't have your documents. So if you have some answer that some question that needs a lock solid answer, you need to call Peter and set up an appointment or get with him and really find out exactly what, let him look at your documents and find out exactly what the answer is, because many, many times your answer could be different. It could be a 180 type situation in that the documents could have some very specific language. Doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it does. And that language would override the statute. And there at that point, you would be stuck with, you would get a different answer. So that's why we say if you're, we're going to give you the best answer we can, but we call them radio answers. It's not because we necessarily make the answer up, but it is because we don't have your documents. So we can't give you what would be considered a legal answer or maybe even a 100% answer, because we don't have those documents. The other thing I'll mention just as a side note, that because we're dealing with a broad range of questions, we do sometimes talk broader in our answer than your specific situation. And so just have some patience with us. We do that so that if somebody has a similar problem, but it's not exactly the same, we may be able to cover their question for them by expanding our answer a little. So that's where we're at with that. So Peter, good morning. How are you this morning?
Good morning, Mark. I'm well. How are you?
Good. Well, I think we've got our first caller this morning.
Nope, that was a robocaller.
Oh, it was robocaller.
Yeah,
good.
So I like
want
to talk to those people.
So
we'll give them a robo answer.
Yeah, we got our first robocaller this morning. That's good. At least somebody's calling us. That's the thing with. I started to get worried, you don't get any phone calls on your cell phone. Then at least every now and then somebody calls me to tell me how my credit's doing, to tell me where, if that I can get health insurance at my age now, and all kinds of good things. So it's always nice to know you're loved and wanted by somebody out there in India or someplace that's going to call me.
Exactly.
give me some help. As a side note, it's kind of fun. So this is why, by the way, for those of you out there, listeners, that you don't want me in your community, because this is the kind of thing, like, how many of you people like to talk to those people? I do. I answer their calls. I get into conversations. Like, one called me the other day and asked me if I was the owner of the business. I told him no, he died. you know, when you do stuff like that, you just got to wait for their reaction. My goal is to always find a question that they can't, some comeback that they just don't know how to answer, and it's a lot of fun. It's amazing. One guy asked me, he said, "We've got money to lend. How much money do you want?" I said, $200 million. but he didn't want to give it to me. But he said he had money to lend. He said, I was approved. I was pre-approved, he said. So
I can't imagine
And
why.
you said 0 interest, I'll take it. Right?
That's right. That's right. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, yeah. So, like I said, we do try to give you the best answers we possibly can, not the sarcastic ones that I can think up, but even the right ones sometimes. And so, if you have a question, you want to call 220-9788, 220-WSTU. And if you're a robocaller, you can call in too, and we'll talk to you. But I have been looking at some of these things, Peter, coming up, and it's funny. I will say that there seems to be, from what I'm talking, or from some of the people I'm talking to around the state, um, we're starting to see more incidents of fraud occurring in associations. I don't know if you've noticed. I mean, I've gone years without ever having had an issue with fraud in one of my associations, or one of my entities. And lately, and for us, we're not auditing for fraud. So I've had people ask me that sometimes. They think an audit, we're going to find stuff that's wrong. We're going to find the fraud or find something that's wrong. And we're not, that's not our job. It really isn't. That's not what a financial statement audit is about. It's really just to determine that the numbers are materially correct. And we're not looking for fraud if we find it, of course. So it's amazing that, if you're not looking for fraud, how it comes up occasionally, and even in some things where we're not even doing an audit. But I've noticed that there seems to have been, over the last couple years, there seems to be more of those types of things out there, and I don't know. I don't know why. It's the economy seems to have been better. But I don't know what the deal is. But
No, I've seen more incidents. Again, not a lot, but just more of accusations of directors, officers misusing funds. Using funds, of the association for their own, for their own personal use. Yeah, I mean, again, for a long time, maybe I saw once. Now I've seen, a few in the last year or so. So again, I don't think it's an epidemic per se, but it definitely is more than I had ever seen in the past. Does that mean just getting caught, or I don't know? But
well, what I worry about a little bit is, and why I think it's important to be on the lookout for it. As a director, or as a board member, or even just a member of the association, one of the things that they talk about when we talk about fraud is they talk about the fraud triangle or the fraud stool or whatever it is, but it's basically a three-legged type thing that you got to have in place. And one is that the person's got to have access to funds. And frankly, in many small associations, they do. The person can post the books and they have access to cash or deposits, or they can sign checks. Sometimes property managers can sign checks, which is not good because their accounting department, may have access to, they have access to the books. And so there's all of those kind of things. But so that's the first thing. The person has to have access to the books and the bank account. But like I said, many small associations, people do. The other thing that you've got to have is some financial pressure, usually, or some sort of a need. And interestingly enough, that's usually in a bad time. That's usually when you see people are gotten behind or their bills or something. They have this pressure. Sometimes it's drugs. Sometimes it's it's alcohol, and sometimes it's just gambling or whatever, all the good vices. So that's always something to keep your eye on. That doesn't mean that every treasurer that you have that likes to go to the casino is a crook, but it does mean that there's the potential for it. So that's the second thing, is that they have to have some sort of a pressure. But the third thing is the one that always stops almost everyone, and that is the person has to be able to rationalize it's okay to steal money and or to do what they're talking about. And that's the one that is usually the toughest to get beyond. A lot of people have needs in their lives and financial issues that they have to deal with, and they go to work every day and they don't steal from their employer. And many of them have access to all of these records. But it's usually that third thing, that rationalization, the ability to say it's okay for me to do this. Most of us can't do that. Um, Ironically, when somebody can do that, it's always the person you least suspect, because it's the nice person that you just can't imagine that they could justify doing that. But sometimes they have a reason. I remember a lady up north years and years ago, and she was worked at a bank, and over a period of about 35 or 40 years, she stole, I don't know, $500,000 or $750,000. Now this is like 35 years ago, so that's a lot of money. And she just took a little bit at a time, and she had to, she tested it out first. It worked, and she kept doing it. But interestingly enough, she was very well known in the community. She was one of the pillars of the community. She gave tons of money to her church, tons of the money to different things, and yet she was stealing it all from the bank. So, but she rationalized it because most of the money was going to the church. She rationalized that it was okay. And so it's kind of that kind of thing. What bothers me a little bit is, are we seeing more ability to rationalize? Are people, starting to lose some of that ethical stability that they used to have, and say, this is a wrong thing, we can't do it. With all the things that are going on nowadays, more and more people are saying, well, it's okay to do that. So anyway, I've seen more of it than I've ever seen in the past. It's not big money, but it's still happening. I mean, 25, 30, 40, $50,000. So that's something I think for people to be aware of in these small associations, these CPA or these small condos and HOAs. They have problems with, they have the potential for risk in those situations. And one of the things, I guess you kind of you touched on a little bit, Peter, but that a lot of times, I think some of these things people don't really fully understand that they're doing something illegal or out and out fraud. Like, for example, I had a treasurer one time at an association that made the property management company book a bunch of expenses on book a bunch of expenses that hadn't been incurred yet. And I, like, whoa, what are you doing? What's going on? Well, they had a big project going on. It was a painting project that they had a special assessment on. And it was early in the year, and the project should have been done. But by the end of the year, they had, I don't think they'd even selected the vendor yet. They had contracts they were reviewing, but I don't think they'd even selected the vendor yet. And he wanted to record the full amount of the expense against the reserves as a, and he wanted to do it because he was afraid if people saw that much cash in the bank, they would want to get the money back. They would, think they needed their money back. So that was his idea. And so he didn't think it was that big of a deal. But, in the SEC world, in the publicly traded company, if your chief financial officer made up numbers to make numbers look better or worse for whatever, to smooth things out, he would go to jail, or she would go to jail for a long time. That's like Manafort type problem. So you're going to go to jail, right? And yet at this level, people don't think
Enron
about it.
Or whatever.
Yeah. Enron was exactly, it's those kind of things, and people don't realize.
Well, sometimes what I've seen, and I think that some whether it's an officer, director, whatever. When you said that when they rationalize doing it, I think sometimes it's a false sense of entitlement.
Yes.
Like, I'm entitled to this reimbursements. I'm entitled to this because I've done X, Y, and Z, and and this is my entitlement as because of the work I've done. Again, it's
Yeah.
an oversimplification.
Or that nobody would care because I'm not being paid anyway, and this is just a little bit of money.
That's what I mean.
Give hours. Yeah. I think that's the thing. I think the other thing is that a lot of times people don't really fully understand how like, for example, you're working on a contract in an association, a homeowners association for landscaping, and the next thing you know, somebody's getting, maybe you were already using them because and you recommended them to the association because they do such a good job, and so they get the contract, and afterwards they just start. Maybe you didn't ask them. You paid your attorney, but you didn't tell him what to do. But you forgot to ask him, and but anyway, they didn't even ask, and they do another cut. Maybe they do 2 cuts, or they do some trimming or some mulching for free, or whatever. And you think, oh, that's no big deal. That's nice of them. That's just being nice. Well, no, they're being nice because you got them a $80,000 contract or $30,000 contract. So, it's those kind of things I think that are the hardest things for people to understand, that sometimes, things that they may think is just somebody really thanking them or being nice is illegal. It's an illegal act.
Yeah, although the law doesn't really have to, or it shouldn't have to, but, it does expressly state, that you can't take unjust enrichment or any type of consideration, whether it's monetary or otherwise, for stuff that you haven't paid for. Like I said, they cut all the common area and they also cut your lawn. No, when I say your, the officer or director. Although obviously, you can't be accepting any kind of gifts.
And you know what the problem there though, Peter, is that a lot of times, like I said, they and here's where it gets a little iffy. It's not that they cut it for free. I think most directors would say, okay, I gave these guys this contract and they're going to cut my yard for free. But what they do is they give you a discount, and you may not even realize what a discount you're getting. It just may be a good price, and it's those kind of things. And then
same thing.
Yeah. It's the same thing. But a lot of times people have a hard time. They don't see that. They don't realize, oh, wait a minute, everybody else is paying $100 and I'm paying $70 for my lawn. What is that? But it's one of those kind of things, it's and so you look at it and you think, geez, why does this happen? But actually
the only thing that's really permitted expressly is if you go to a trade show or some sort of educational thing, you can accept up to $25, like food and swag. They give a little.
So you get a cup of coffee from Starbucks, and that's about it. Beyond that.
Yeah, but literally that's what the law says. So if you go to one of these trade show conventions or things like that, or go to a course like I teach courses, you can.
And it's interesting.
You can get a cup of coffee and a donut.
You guys give them some free donuts. It's interesting that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. Is probably the most prevalent fraud is the type of things we're talking about right now. They're hard to catch. I mean, how do you ever find out that somebody's getting their lawn cut for a discounted price unless they volunteer it? That, which brings me back to the thing. One of the most common ways that fraud is identified or found is not by an audit. It falls down into some like 5% or 10% category or something. It's actually by the person admitting it. That's what happens. They're confronted with a situation. They actually admit it and explain what they've been doing. Sometimes the person that's confronting them doesn't even know that they did it. A lot of times the people are looking for an opportunity to to just confess because it's weighing on them. It's funny that is situation I was talking about with that the little old lady that was giving her money to the church.
Mm-hmm.
She actually confessed because she just over a period of time realized and felt bad about it, and wanted to, um, and plus she got caught. At least, I mean, she was starting to get caught. But it's that's the thing, is that a lot of people, one of the things they used to tell us as auditors is that we sit down with somebody and we actually ask the association, the board, people, has there been any fraud that you're aware of, or do you know of any fraud? And it's funny, that's the audit step that results in any of these usually being found, is that when you ask the person that, they usually admit they're doing it, or they might start, or they might talk about how, something's going on, or this is that. But anyway, that was interesting. The other thing I wanted to talk about, Peter, is just, and I'll give the number again: 220-978-9788, or 220-WSTU is the number in the studio. The other thing that was funny, came up, Peter, again, and I just mentioned it for those out there that are listening, that I was at a meeting, and the the board was having a meeting, and they're talking about, the it was there was no majority. It was a 2-2 or something, because the president couldn't vote. And I said,
I hear that so often.
I know. And I said, no, the president can vote. In fact, the president's required to vote, because they're a board member. So they have to
Right.
vote. If they're a board member, they have to vote. And but people don't realize that. The other thing they don't realize is that president or the treasurer or whoever is not in that position for the rest of their life. They didn't get elected to treasurer. They are just, and that's the confusion, because usually somebody that was treasurer is dropping off the board. And so the other person that's running is kind of running to fill their seat. So they just kind of assume that they're running to be the treasurer or whatever it is. Well, they're not. They're just a board member. So, and I know, the other thing was that the president can't make a motion, which, I know, I think that's kind of Robert's rules or something, isn't it? But that doesn't really apply here at this level. I mean, unless you've got something that prohibits it, because anybody can make a motion. Any board member can make a motion. A lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
the president, or a lot of times the person
So
who's
they're confusing it with, the president of an assembly.
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, for example, I always use because it's the most well-known or obvious example, and by no means am I a parliamentarian. Okay, I'll 100% admit that, but they confuse it with, like, the United States Congress,
Mhm.
right, where the vice president actually sits as, quote, the president of the Congress,
Senate.
or the president of
Senate.
the Assembly.
Yeah.
So every now and then, and if there's a tie, like in the Senate vote, right,
Mhm.
the vice president casts the tie-breaking vote as the, quote, president of the Assembly, or
Mhm.
president of the Senate. Otherwise, he doesn't vote, right? He only votes if there's a 50-50 tie or other tie. But as you said, in a corporate context, the corporation is run by the board. Although frequently the president, is also a board member, I guess, in some, at least with condominium and homeowner associations. So when you're meeting as a board, even though the president might be the chairman of the meeting, he or she is also there wearing their board hat. They're, just the regular director hat. As you said, every director, actually by law, for every issue, must either vote yes, no, or abstention. And you have to indicate in the minutes, quite frankly, under the law, how every director voted. In the minutes specifically, yes, no, or abstention. You really shouldn't be marking down votes. It passed 4-3, or it failed 4-3, or passed 5-2. I'm just using a 7-person board just as an example. Because every director's vote, again, is supposed to be recorded in the minutes how he or she voted. And even when I do my board certification courses, one of my slides, or one of the parts of it, is, does the president vote? People look at me, what? And I go, well, because I get this question a lot. So I go into why the president, assuming the president's on the board, votes. Because every year I get, what kind of vote do we need? Because I'm not voting, or I don't vote. I go, what do you mean you're not voting? You don't vote? Yes, you do, because the president's talking to me on the phone.
Right.
I explain, no, you do vote. You don't just break ties. And so there's a misperception out there about the role of voting. I'm not saying it's super prevalent, but it's there is definitely perception out there in some quarters that that he or she only breaks the ties, and that's just not the way it goes. That's not the way it works.
Yeah, and it caused a lot of confusion. But it's and it's funny because a lot of times when this comes up, they've been doing it this way for years. Doing it this way for years. Well, it's not right. So you got to change it. But,
right.
Exactly.
But
it's
because when you're elected on the board or appointed on the board, if it's maybe due to a vacancy because of resignation or death or something, but whether you're elected by the membership or you're elected by the board to fill a vacancy that occurs because of a resignation or a death, you're on the board, and as a director, you must direct. That's your role.
Right.
So every director, has an equal vote as a director, and it is important that they all vote, and which is why we have odd number of boards too. I mean, you want a board typically of 5, 7, 9, whatever. So actually, to try to avoid the ties, because quite frankly, there is no way to break that tie,
right.
other than try to get the motion to be amended so it's more of a compromise to bring the two sides together. But if the board splits, let's say it's 3-3 with one abstention, then they're deadlocked on that issue.
Yeah.
And the president doesn't break that tie. It's just, all right, now we got to figure out some other way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. So
because that would be giving the president 2 votes as a director,
right?
And they don't get 2 votes as a director.
Yeah, that's a common misconception that I've heard a lot of people say, that either the president doesn't vote or the president only breaks a tie, or that the president does decide, the tie. If there's any kind of if there was a tie among the members, then the president gets to decide.
No, doesn't break that tie either.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of interesting. I've had people say, okay, well, it was it was a tie vote, at a meeting typically, like you say, that doesn't have every member present. And people say, well, then whatever the president votes for is what counts. Well, no, it's not.
Okay.
I've heard that. The other thing that I think comes up a lot of times is that with these associations is that the concept of the profit versus nonprofit corporations, that causes so much confusion. Because people don't really understand the difference between, a legal structure and the protections that you get legally and tax. So if you're a not-for-profit corporation, they assume you're a nonprofit for tax purposes. And if for some reason you're a for-profit corporation under the Florida statutes, that you automatically are subject to tax in a different manner, or you file your tax return in a different manner, or you have different issues. And the tax laws don't care what you call yourself.
Well, obviously it's because, people are so used to the term not-for-profit in a generic sense, and I'm just speaking the obvious here,
right,
applying to the church,
right,
or the educational institution or the charitable organization. And they just think, oh, not-for-profit means one of those type of entities.
Right.
No.
And it's and there's some confusion on that, but it has nothing to do with, it actually has to do with whether or not you're a volunteer member organization or whatever, in terms of how you're taxed. And even under the nonprofit world, it's only the 501c3s, which 501A is the stat
IRS.
is the IRS code section that deals with nonprofits. And then 501c is the section that defines a specific portion of the nonprofit entities. And so a C is a charitable, educational, or welfare benefit or welfare organization, health organization. There are welfare benefit organizations. Those are other sections. There's C4s and C7s, and country clubs are C7s, 501c7. So there's different sections, and they're taxed differently under the IRS code, depending upon what type of membership organization they are or how they fall in. So it is, but it has nothing to do if you were an corporation at all. If you are just an association, let's say you didn't incorporate, but you're functioning as an association, you're running the day-to-day operations, you don't have, and you've been doing it that way, you're still required to file a tax return. You're still an association subject to tax, even though you're not incorporated. Non-incorporated organizations are still subject to tax. And so they don't care what the state does. Now, if you're running an organization like that as an association without being incorporated, you got a whole lot of liability, personally. And that's what the legal stuff is about. That's what the statute is about, is providing that legal protection for how the entity is being run and the board members and the members and what kind of legal, risk they're taking. But a lot of people just don't track with that sometimes. So it's a common question. I'll have people say, well, we're for profit, so that's different. Taxes are different now. Well, they're not. They're the same regardless of what you have to be. You just got more liability. As I explained to an association the other day, you just got more liability as a for-profit entity because there's more of an assumption under the law that you should know, even though you're not for profit tax-wise. You're not getting a profit tax-wise. The same type of thing. You're held to a little higher standard. So anyway, it's kind of some of the things that we're just seeing this time of the year, and I thought it's good to bring it up because now's the time to deal with it and the time to talk about some of these things, because we're going to have the election season coming up, and a lot of people don't understand. And then the other thing that happens from time to time, and I know, Peter, you've talked about this before, is that they get somebody on the board who's been appointed to an officer position, whether it be treasurer or president or whatever, and the person's gone rogue, and the rest of the board members just sit around like, well, we can't do anything, and they can. They as you've said a number of times, Peter, the officers serve from board meeting to board meeting, not from annual meeting to annual meeting. So,
right. I mean, officer, the whole thing about officers, and as far as their election and their removal, it's governed by the bylaws, and almost every set of bylaws I've ever seen, maybe there's one exception, I don't know, but basically provides, officers are elected by the board. And by the way, just for review for everybody, that is the only time that the board can vote in a secret ballot, is when they're electing the officers. Otherwise, every other board vote is an open, voice vote where every director's vote. But when they elect officers, it's the only time by statute that you can have a secret vote. Anyway, and almost every set of bylaws I've ever read, officers are elected by the board and serve at the pleasure. When I give lectures, I say displeasure. I think it's more accurate. But they serve pretty much at the discretion of the board. Now, that's not to say you should be changing your officers every week.
Yes.
That's not really stable. But if there is an officer, whether it's the president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, who you believe is not performing their role as an officer properly, then the other board members at a duly noticed open board meeting, except where the vote can be secret though, can, change. Now, that doesn't mean that person's off the board. That's another misperception. Oh, they're out. That means they're off as president and off the board. No. Only the members can remove a director from the board unless the director somehow becomes disqualified because of delinquency or felon or stealing from the association or, otherwise becoming disqualified. But as far as removal, the board cannot remove one of their own from the board. They can remove that person from their office. So the person who maybe was the president, and you decide, well, we don't like the job that he or she is doing as president, so we're going to vote in someone else as president. The former president is still on the board and still has a vote on the board and functions as a director. Just that the board cannot remove that person from the board if they're so inclined. So they don't have that authority.
Yeah. And
so that's just a class, because there's also confusion between that too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then the other thing, and there's been a change in law on this, and Peter, I'll have you go through it, but and so I'm just going to give my opinion on this, but I never give my opinion, right? I don't have one. It's never controversial. I do think that you should that associations should have staggered boards, and what that means is that every
you like that institutional memory.
Yep, that's exactly right. I do think that, because like you said, you start changing over back and forth, first of all, you've got a lot of things that have got to be adjusted, but people forget what was being done, why it was being done, why it can't be done, what the deal is, and there's no consistency. So I think that I don't like permanent terms where the person is president for the next 400 years, but they pass it down to their kids with the unit. But it is but I do like the idea that you've got a portion of the board, and it can be as simple as half one year and half the other, or a little more than half the next.
It's usually an odd number.
Yeah.
Every other year, because you have an odd number board typically.
Right. And so because it does provide some stability, it's nice to have that kind of constant association with it. Yeah, a lot of the nonprofits that I'm involved with, we always, we will have the, we'll even have officer positions that'll be more stable, even though they can be changed, like we just talked about. We'll have a president-elect or something like that, so that you kind of have who's coming up, but there again, it's that's a different environment. But like I said, in this situation, it's nice to have some directors that have a history more than just 6 months or 10 days or whatever it happens to be. Because in defense of our board members out there, this is a confusing area. It really is. It's hard. Some of this stuff is really hard to determine what you're supposed to do. It's not logical. It may not be something that you agree with, but you have to apply it. It's the law and whatever. So I appreciate.
Well, the law on that is that directors serve for 1-year terms unless otherwise provided by the governing documents, articles of incorporation and/or bylaws, depending on or you might have to amend both. It all depends how your documents are written. You do see occasionally where the developer will write documents with staggered boards from the get-go, from the initial, or at least from the turnover point. But for the most part, bylaws are written where directors serve 1-year terms. You can amend them to create the staggered term. The staggered term, it can be staggered 2-year terms. I've seen staggered 2-year terms. I've seen staggered 3-year terms, where every other year you're electing either, let's say it's a 7-person board, so every other year you're electing either 3 or 4 directors for a 2-year term. And you can amend the documents if you have 1-year terms. Typically, you would create the stagger in year 1. And then the stagger would go on after that. The stagger being created in year 1, saying the top 4 vote getters get 2 years, the bottom 3 vote getters get 1 year, and then it's 2 years after that to establish the stagger. Or if it's a 9-person board, maybe you want to have 3-3-3, where everyone serves 3-year terms. But if you want to go the stagger route, the condo law bounced all over the place for a few years there, where you couldn't have 3-year term staggers and you can have 2, and they didn't like 2 either. But now it's kind of drifted back to what I would call a more normal situation, except for the term limits, which is still confusing.
Yeah. They're supposed to fix that coming up, I guess.
But hope so. So bottom line is, if your documents, have, what I would call the standard or, fairly standard 1-year terms, you can amend them, and many communities have, to create the staggered terms.
Yeah, and so it is one of those kind of things where, like I said, it may require that you amend your bylaws. It may require that you amend your documents to be able to do it. But and then the other thing is that I find is that you use 7, Peter, as a just an arbitrary number in terms of, but that actually is a very, very good number. If you get too many,
yeah, I like 5 or 7 depending on the size of the community.
Yeah, because if you get more than 7, it's hard to get a quorum sometimes.
Or sometimes it's hard just to find people to fill the seats.
Right. Yeah, that too. And
get enough people to run.
Yeah. So you have open seats, and then you have problems with quorums, and that kind of thing. And then and if you get too small, it's a problem. One person misses a meeting and you can't do anything, or whatever. It's one of those kind of deals. So I think that you're right. 5 or 7. If you're in a smaller association, 5 is probably the most you can hope for.
Yeah, the Condominium Act defaults to 5 if your documents are silent or don't really have a provision for how many directors. Unless you have a small, under X amount of units, then it drops to 3. But I find, for most associations, not all, that 5 or 7 works, pretty well. I mean, I have several associations that do have 9, but typically it's 5 or 7.
Yeah. So then, I guess the last thing I was going to kind of talk about is, because we're starting to see more of those, is for those out there who are maybe just listening and maybe not living in an association right now, that are thinking about moving to Florida and maybe here for the season or whatever the deal is. When you move into an association, you need to make sure you check out their documents to find out, what the rules are, and that's the thing. People tend to just look at the rules and regulations, and in most associations, those can be changed by the board on a regular basis. They can be amended, and so if you're looking at that, you might say, well, that's not that bad, or I don't like that, or whatever. But that may not be the issue. The issue is more what's in your declaration, what's in your articles and your bylaws and things like that. And those may be harder to change or may not be able to be changed at all. So you need to look at that. You need to look at the frequently asked questions. You need to look at the financial statements, particularly the budget and the last audited or reviewed or compiled financials, or just whatever financial statements they have available, including the footnotes. The footnotes will tell you a lot. And by the way, if you're buying a unit, ask to see the last set of CPA prepared financials or CPA audited financials, whatever the case may be, and read those footnotes. Now they may not be required to do it, but if they are, read those report and particularly read the footnotes. You might not be a numbers person, so you might not understand the balance sheet or the income statement or anything. That's okay, but the footnotes are going to be written in at least some common language. They're basically understandable. They're not just all numbers. So you can get a very good a very good understanding of what the issues are in the association by reading those and finding out what's happening and what's been done and what's happened in the past. And so that's a good place to look. And it's also a good idea to look at those reserves and see what kind of money's in those reserves. But and because your association your unit may be worth more money than the unit next door, in the building next door, because you've got reserves, and that building is going to be looking at a $20,000 special assessment or something. So so look at those things, what's in the reserves, whether they've been fully funded, they're currently fully funded or partially funded. And if there's any kind of shortfall, when the last time a reserve study was done, those kind of things will help you figure out what's going to happen and what needs to happen. And everybody should look at that, whether you're an investor or going to be a second home or an owner or whatever for primary residence, whatever. But take a look at those kind of things and make sure you understand. The other thing I was going to say is, because we now have a lot more developer projects coming online, and the laws have changed now, so there's more information out there on developers, from a developer turnover standpoint, in the condo world at least, and in the HOA world too. Um, make sure you understand what you're getting into if you're moving into a developer controlled association. And that's not bad per se, but it can be, because if that developer fails, or isn't committed to certain things, you may be stuck holding the bag, and or you may be stuck with a situation where your dues are going to go up significantly, because they in effect were being subsidized to some degree by the developer, either because they were able to negotiate a different contract than you'll be able to negotiate. I see that all the time, is these large landscape companies and others, they will do a developer's project, a big developer project. They'll do them cheaper than they would do a regular community, because they know that developer can send them a lot of business, or take a lot of business away from them. So many times their prices are more competitive, if you want to look at it that way, to a developer than they would be to an association that's turned over. And you just got to be careful of that, because some of those costs could go up, and you just need to be aware of what's involved in them. And you also need to be aware of whether or not the developers established reserves, and what those reserves are, and what your legal responsibility is going to be to maintain those things. Um, a lot of times people don't pay a lot of attention to preservation areas, and mangrove preservation, and non and native plant preservation, or whatever the stuff is, that, and even water rights. I've had associations that the if the water rights, the right to potable water, wasn't defined, there wouldn't be enough water for the association to have, because it was going to a golf course or something else. So anyway, it's those kind of things, when you're going into a developer controlled association, you need to pay attention to, because there are things like that could become an issue for you, if and when the developer pulls out and they're not supporting that kind of stuff anymore. So just keep that in mind too. It's something to watch. I think you're having a lot more of that type of activity down south, aren't you, Peter? There are a lot of stuff coming online down there.
Yeah. I mean, the development has definitely picked up, in the last few years. With the real estate market improving, and there's a lot more new projects than there were a few years ago.
What and we've only got a couple minutes, so just kind of at a high level, what are some of the issues that you see primarily when an association is coming out of developer, when you're picking an association up, as it's going through turnover? What kind of issues are you seeing?
Well, the two primary issues still, I think, really haven't changed that much through the years. I mean, at least from my perspective, which is the construction and the accounting.
Okay.
Particularly, with the condominium development, you want to, be retaining an engineer to inspect the property. Both the residential building, the amenity buildings, if they're separate, and hire an accountant, to look through the books and records, because you have a certain window of time to resolve any issues with the developer, or the developer subcontractors regarding construction. And you want to make a as thorough as you can analysis of the property, because sometimes defects are not visible to the naked eye. So you can't just trust your own eye. You got to hire that structural engineer to really look at the property pretty thoroughly. So those two things I think are still at the top of any association list.
All right. Well, we probably won't be back next week because it's Christmas Eve.
Christmas Eve.
We're gonna take that day off, but hopefully you guys will all have a great holiday, a great Christmas, and Happy New Year. And we'll be back after Christmas. But thanks for joining us right here on WSTU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.